Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Natasha, and today I am sharing another great conversation that I had with executive coach Shawn on team dynamics, the pros and cons of assessments, and how leaders can guide their teams through interpersonal struggles. In this episode, we mention Bruce Tuckman's stages of team development, which are forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. I'll do a quick overview of the stages, but I would also encourage any person who leads others to research this more, because when you understand team stages of development, you will have an easier time diagnosing team challenges and finding new ways to help your team overcome these challenges. In the forming stage, the team is coming together and everyone is on their best behavior. In the storming stage, members are starting to push back on one another's ideas and contributions, and the members are exploring the boundaries of their roles on the team. It's important to mention that many teams never make it past the storming stage. In the norming stage, the team has learned, and is maybe still learning a bit, of how to accept one another's viewpoints for the benefit of the group, and they are finally starting to actually feel like a team. The performing stage is the spot where most teams want to be. There is psychological safety and trust among the team, and they all know their own and others' contributions and how they come together to make the team successful. The adjourning stage occurs when the team needs to break apart for a number of reasons. This is not necessarily a negative thing. Some teams and team members just need to move on to the next thing. If you have a team that is in the norming or performing stage and a new member is added to the group or subtracted from the group, that change can cause the team to go back to the forming and norming stages of development. Adding or subtracting one individual can change composition of the interactions, so the team needs to rebuild itself. We work in teams all the time, and sometimes we wonder why it seems so difficult because we've done it so many times before, but team dynamics is the answer why. This conversation with Shawn will shed even more light on this. Thank you so much for joining me once again, Shawn. Could I have you introduce yourself and tell us your style of leadership and coaching?
Well, you betcha. And thank you again for having me. I had so much fun the last time that we spoke. I'm Shawn Perry. I am owner, founder of Value Leadership Solutions out here in North Alabama, and provide leadership training and coaching and speaking on occasion to folks in the local area and out of state. So it's been pretty good for us. My style really is, I partner with my clients, my coaching clients in particular, because it is a partnership. They have objectives, they have goals, they have things they need to get resolved. And my perspective is that those answers are already inside of them. They probably know somewhere in their thinking and their philosophies and their gut what they're supposed to do, but I see my role really as helping them uncover that and really give them the permission to explore all of those things that they may be too intimidated to do so or want to avoid. So I ask lots of questions in my coaching to help people explore their answer to the solution, not my answer to their problem.
I really love how you said partnership, because I think that leadership has evolved. Of course, it needs to evolve, but it's evolved so much over the last 100 years where it really is more of a side-by-side type of thing. Leaders need to have these skills that are coaching, that are bringing people along with them, that are really good collaboration skills. Yeah. And the need for interpersonal skills has become so heavy that even, I think World Economic Forum had said by 2025, 8 of the top 10 skills are interpersonal skills. Like, do you know how to get along with people and help empower them?
Sure. I had the opportunity this morning at a coaching session with this manager who has a couple of new employees that are coming up into leadership positions. And here is your example to share with them the way I share with you. And she's like, wow, I guess it is. I said, yeah. So we talked through. I asked her, I said, well, how are you going to do that? She's like, oh my God, I don't know. But she knew, and she came up with a good plan.
I I think you hit the nail right on the head there too, where it's like at first when people go into coaching, they're like, I don't really know, like I don't know what to do. And then just through those thoughtful questions, they get to this place where they're like, I do know what to do. I do know the next steps.
Oh, and it's so powerful with this, to watch them over the last really year and a half, how far they have come. And I remind them of that. I said, let's think back to something. I flip back in the notebook, right? I say, hey, remember we used to talk about this? And like, oh yeah, man, we're way past that kind of problem. I'm like, I know, good for you, right? And you get it.
So I know you've held a lot of different types of leadership roles. Was there a moment kind of at the beginning of your leadership journey where you were like, I'm the leader, I'm the person in charge? Or was there like that catalyst event for you?
That's a great question. And I thought about that. I mean, how far back do you go, rather than saying, well, they say that you lead yourself. If you can't lead yourself, you can lead all that kind of stuff. But I remember in high school, right now, this is, I don't know, maybe this is relatable to folks, but I remember standing outside the movie theater at the mall with a bunch of my classmates and buddies, probably about 6 or 7 of us. And we were standing around like, oh, what movie are we going to see? And it's like, well, let's go. I don't know, Moronicus. Which one do you want to go see? Well, I don't know, Stupidicus. Which one do you? And I'm like, hey, let's go see this. And I started walking towards the ticket booth, and people just following. Somebody just needed to make a decision. I don't know if that was the moment, but it's one that I hearken back to because I see it even today. I'm out with my peers on this offsite a week and a half ago. It's like, oh, we're going to go to dinner. I'm like, oh gosh, here we go again. This never ends. I said, well, we're going to go to X restaurant. And like, okay. And we went to that. I mean, it's just somebody just make a decision because we'll sit here and debate it for 30 minutes, right? So I think that's my how I became a leader story is I just got fed up with people's waffling and made a decision.
That can be the hardest thing to do is to make a decision. People love to be indecisive or they would rather do nothing. So one of the...
Well, you go to a dinner party, right? The very first person that leaves, that first couple that grabs their coats and says goodbye, man, you busted it open right there. Everybody else is just going pouring out. Somebody's got to be the first. I know what I'm doing. Might as well be me.
That actually goes really well into our main topic for today, team dynamics, because making decisions and with coaching and walking alongside people, it helps to create better dynamics among people and among teams. So for you, how would you describe team dynamics?
Really, the first thing I do is define team, right? Because we've got groups of people all over the place that are, you're categorized as this, that, or the other, groups, but what do teams are? So I looked at some things, and I've got many go-tos for things, right? But if you're going to talk anything about teams, you can't go wrong talking about Patrick Lencioni, right? I mean, he's written books, right? So he must know what he's talking about, right? But Pat Lencioni, his consulting firm and his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and then his follow-up, Overcoming the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, he defines leadership, or not leadership, but team. And he wrote it as team is a relatively small number of people that share common goals as well as the rewards and responsibilities for achieving them. A relatively small number of people that share common goals as well as the rewards and the responsibilities for achieving them. So in some organizations, they're big and you have teams of teams, but it's not like, team of my 26,000 person corporation. I think, when you look at human history, even from a biblical sense, Adam and Eve were kind of the first team. Your family got to feed each other, got to take care of each other. So they had a common goal to survive and worship and all those kinds of things. So we've been around teams as a human species for a long, long time. Dynamics. Wow. Well, I think of really the dynamics of teams because it's people, and so there's interactions. And you have the actions and the processes of the team, the roles and the relationships of the members of the team. You have changes and evolutions, as we talk about stages of team development, all that. For all of those things, actions, processes, and relationships, it's in that context of trying to work together. It's that all that happens within a group of people that are trying to achieve together, collaboratively, a desired and common goal. I mentioned groups earlier. Teams and groups are different. Okay, we got all that. But again, it's that what are we going after? What are we trying to achieve? And are we working together to do that? Now, you could be a part of a political association. That's great, and vote a certain way. But what are you doing with other people to make things, to achieve an end? So different groups, teams. Textbook time. Group dynamics has a whole nice section in there on teams. And the author of this one, Donelson, Forsythe, it said, teams, unlike groups, require more from the members in the way of collaboration and coordination. I just like that quote. Teams, unlike groups, require more from the members in the way of collaboration and coordination. And I like that because as I coach business owners, as I coach leaders, they need really to recognize that not everybody in their group has that same vision. One of their jobs as the leader is to orient folks in the group to that vision and then empower them, work with them, develop that team to achieve that, right? And it's only once everybody shares that same vision that it becomes a team as opposed to just being a group of folks.
And I really appreciate how you highlighted just all the different aspects that have to be considered when you're thinking about team dynamics, right? First to split the two words up, but then with because dynamics is everything. It's everything that's said and not said, and body language and feelings and things and compartmentalized things and then not. And I always love to see how different groups interact and different teams, because the reason why they're there that normally surfaces, and then when those teams come together and they move towards that, it can be very inspiring.
What I enjoy about leading teams is there's the mechanics of it. We have to have meetings, we have schedules, we got agendas, we got processes, procedures, but then there's also that squishy human stuff. Like you just have the emotions, the feelings, the relationships. I like that.
What qualities does a leader need to cultivate to help a team navigate challenges and overcome those interpersonal struggles?
The leader need to cultivate. I look at this, this is a good question, but I think you need to approach it from two different ways. One, for the leader, what do they got to do to cultivate themselves? Because they're the leader. So they have to kind of have their act together to be able to take care of others. I guess when it comes to the characteristics of teams, what makes good teams and stuff, I mean, there are racks and racks of books at Barnes and Nobles, right? That kind of get after that sort of thing. But we got to keep in mind, right, with the stages of team development, the role of the leader changes. During the forming stage, really, as a team is new and we kind of figure things out, they really look to that leader to be very directive and provide specific guidance and to organize and motivate and move people forward. But then as the team grows in maturity, then you get to the norming phase, right? When people are just, okay, now we're doing our thing. We've made it through storming. Now the leader's role shifts to more of a consultant kind of a role. And so one of the qualities then that a leader needs to have is the ability to be flexible like that. You can't still be that directive later in team growth because you're going to lose effectiveness because the team needs to do their thing. So the leader has to build those qualities within themselves, right? That kind of flexibility and that sort of thing. But now for the team, yes, there's absolutely other parts that the team needs to have. And from Pat Lencioni on his 5 dysfunctions, the number one dysfunction. If folks have not read this book, it's highly recommended, right? I mean, he's got a triangle in it, so it's a legitimate model. But the very bottom of the triangle is an absence of trust. That's the number one dysfunction. If a team doesn't have trust, nothing else matters. They're never really going to be effective. They'll get things done and you'll produce a product or provide a service, but you're never going to achieve what could be achieved if folks don't trust each other. It lends into all the other dysfunctions. So as a leader, that I think is the number one thing to do, is to work deliberately, because it won't happen by accident, but you got to be very deliberate in building trust amongst the members of the team. Right? You got to trust each other's skills. People have to be really, vulnerability comes into that. I mean, that's not to have a whole discussion about trust, but in the context of a team, if I know what your strengths are and kind of maybe what you're not so good at, well, then on the team, we're going to have people that fill in for that, or not that are covering for each other, but really it makes it a more solidified. You don't really have the gaps anymore because you've got a variety and a diverse team that's able to, keep the whole circle smooth.
Patrick Lencioni, he had posted this thing on Twitter where he said, when teams come together, when there is trust, then they know that when you're telling them about something they need to improve, it's for the betterment of the team and it's not just to be a jerk.
I mean, who wouldn't want to work on a team where if you had a thought or idea, you could voice it without fear of ridicule. Where you felt safe to, okay, well, let's really reach for the brass ring here, to harken back to Catcher in the Rye. But, to be able to put yourself out there and know that they're going to accept it or not accept the idea, but that you are still accepted. I mean, that's huge. So as a leader, depending on the situations, the kinds of people you have and everything else, that's the number one objective. Build that quality within your team, is that quality of trust.
So you had already brought up the Tuckman's phases of stages of group formation. So how is that process interrupted or restructured when someone who's not the leader, but when someone is added or subtracted from the team?
Oh yeah, it's a good one. I immediately think about equilibrium, not balance per se, but like an equilibrium. And we've got a pool here at the house, and during the summertime when I was running, I'd run back to the house and I would look at that pool and that nice cool blue water, and it's just sparkling there in the sunlight. It's smooth, little shimmers in there from the sunlight. But I would grab a couple of floats, some noodles, and I would jump in just to cool off from the run. And obviously jumping into the pool creates ripples and waves, and I think it's all discombobulated. And then I'd grab those floats and I would just, literally because I was exhausted at that point, wrap them in my arms, and I would just sit there and not move, just float around the pool, get kind of slowly moved around by the current from the jets. But what would happen, obviously, is the water starts to become less wavy, right? Maybe my breathing creates some of that, but it smooths back out again eventually, right? So I think the same thing applies when it comes to some kind of interruption or some kind of restructure if people leave or come into a group that's going through a stage. And so I really think stages somewhat ebb and flow through the various teams, ebb and flow through the stages because of these very things. If you inject somebody into it, it could be good or bad. Maybe it's not the right person in there. If somebody leaves, sometimes getting the right person out makes all the difference in the world. The bottom line, though, is anytime that you do change up the dynamic of the team or the membership of the team, you kind of have to reset a little bit. Now, I think high functioning teams and high performing teams, they can do that faster, right? They can go, because suddenly you're back to forming because you got this new person that doesn't know the processes, they don't know the procedures. So you got to get them up to speed quickly. And if the team is already kind of highly performing, they do that rather easily. They bring them in. As a good leader, you would have screened the people out. You're not going to bring in somebody that's going to gum up the works, right? So that's helpful. But they're able to bring them in easily. Now, if you've got a team that's not very high performing and they already have struggles, it's not going to really help right away unless the person that you got rid of was the one causing the problems. And or so you bring somebody in that's actually going to bring that fresh air, that fresh insight, or maybe that leadership that's what's lacking. But either way, it just disrupts whatever the status quo was for good or bad. But eventually it reestablishes itself, maybe at a different level, but it reestablishes itself to some sense of normalcy.
You are a certified DISC consultant.
Yes, ma'am.
So when it comes to team dynamics or any stage of team formation, what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of using an assessment with a group?
Well, this is a very good question. And you're right, as a DISC consultant, I'm all about the assessments. I consider them a tool. Right, that they are a tool to use as you're trying to enhance communication and performance. Right, if I can communicate effectively because I know how you operate. And so for those that don't know it, the DISC assessment, DISC, is a behavioral assessment that really gets after a person's behavioral characteristics, how they respond to things when they're stressed out, when they're at work, what they think people, how they expect or they think people expect them to behave. It does all this, and it helps you if you understand where they come from, what their fear is, or what their language is. I mean, the 5 love languages, right, from Dr. Chapman, another great reference for that. But, if I can speak to somebody in a way that they're going to understand it, then I'm going to be able to communicate more effectively with them. And then, so in a team dynamic, that's very helpful because we are all unique. And not that everybody is either a D, an I, an S, or a C. We're blendings of all of that. But if you can codify it in that language to this person and then say the exact same message to somebody else in a different way that resonates with them, then they're going to understand it better, and you're going to get the best, right? The best out of the people. So I think in that sense, it's very, very helpful. If the team understands how everybody else responds and perceives language and instruction, well, then they're going to respond in those ways too. Or they're going to say, oh, when that person just said that, that's kind of their default. That's not against me. That's just something that they said, right? So because that's the way their brain works, I won't take it the wrong way. You have a better understanding, a better relationship with people and team if you know these kinds of things about them. All right, that's great. The drawback, though, is relying too heavily on those and trying to force people into what the paper says. All right, and that's very easy to do. It's like, well, you're an I, so you probably have zero organizational skills. Well, that's not true. I know plenty of I's that are very organized because they have to be. As a high I myself, I force myself to be organized so that I can, go out and yuck it up with the people without letting the glass balls drop. If you try to force people into it, or if you think back, say, oh, well, they only did that because of this, and so you kind of blow off whatever it is that they're suggesting. Well, that's the other thing too. The assessments are a tool, but they don't make up for that actual human face-to-face kind of interaction. Another quick book reference on this, because we're talking about this. I got this Sticky Teams here. This is another one I got. Larry Osborne, Sticky Teams. He's got nice honeybees and honeycomb on the cover here, right? So it's a very warm feeling to look at it. He described a situation as a new pastor in a church, and he found that when having conflict with one of his church board members, because he was kind of new to that whole thing, he chalked it up to sin. And of course he writes, says, yeah, most of the sin was on their part, right? I mean, that's a typical thing. It's that, it's somewhat of a confirmation bias. It's sort of, so it's a dismissal of really what could be the real issue there. And so you got to get past that. So I can't just say, oh, well, yeah, it's because you're a this based off your assessment. That's why you responded this way. Well, no, it doesn't do that. People are unique. And the assessments are great tools to use to enhance communication, but relying solely on what is printed on a piece of paper instead of the emotion in a teammate's eyes, well, that can really cause you to miss the important issues. So I think that's the drawback to them. So I think it's a good tool, but you have to be alert and aware all the time.
I love how you said that element of just remember the human behind the assessment. So even if we think we know how somebody's going to respond in a stressful situation or in a really, joyous situation, there are other things just within the environment and within life that push us to behave in unexpected ways sometimes. So right. Like you said, looking at the person and seeing what it is that's going on helps add to how you already interact.
It gives you another insight into what they might do, right? How they could respond, because there are people, free will. Something that I think the assessments do provide, though, and I didn't mention this earlier, though, for the individuals, it's that enhanced self-awareness. So if I know that, as an I, right? So we've learned that I's, they fear rejection. Right, that's their biggest fear. So if as an I, somebody, doesn't respond to the email or the text, and I say, oh, well, what the heck, do they not like me anymore? Or am I out? Did I do something wrong? I can say, well, wait a minute. If I think about it, that's probably not the case, right? Because I know this person is busy and I know their characteristics and they're probably doing these other things. So I'm not going to take it personally that they did not immediately respond to my text message. Because I can be self-aware and I can pause that and then sure enough find out, oh yeah, I was at appointment or whatever it was. So the self-awareness aspect, and that's a whole other topic. I'm all about the power of knowing who we are is helpful. And so I think in the sense of a team, not only now do I know what strengths I bring, but I also know, where some of my blind spots might be. In a team setting, if there's trust, and someone can point out the blind spot to me and I don't take it personal. So assessments are good for that. We just can't rely on them 100%, solely. That can't be the only thing we look at.
So earlier you had mentioned those high-performing teams. How are team dynamics different between high-performing teams and low-performing teams?
Lencioni says that the true measure of a team is that it accomplishes the results that it sets out to achieve, right? So either you do it or you don't. But as I had mentioned, right, there's a whole spectrum of doing it. How effective are you putting out your product? How large of a market are you reaching if that's what you're trying to do, right? So there's, how do you do that? So what is the difference? High performing teams, really, they do it better than the low performing teams, I suppose. But really a way to look at them, right? Because you talk about watching teams and seeing people in action. You're right, it is kind of fun. I mean, it's almost like a sport. When you watch those interactions and how that all works, because just like on a team sport, right, the team is working together to score points or whatever they got to do to win the game. Well, with a team, if they're all working towards that same end state, then everybody is somewhat synchronized and they're moving in the right direction. And you can very easily see when you've got those spotlight rangers that we all were familiar with from our Army days, but those folks that are in it for themselves, they're in it for their own ego, their own glory, can quickly pick up on those naysayers and the stuck in the mud kind of people. And so it's high performing teams are moving in a certain direction. Low performance teams, they're just, they struggle really to be as good as they could be. So apart from having trust and confidence, being comfortable with internal conflict, right? These are all signs of a high performing team. Having a strong commitment to team goals, peer and team accountability, and then that laser focus on the results, right? Those are coming right out of the 5 dysfunctions, right? And what you want to have happening on your team. One aspect that's interesting that he doesn't really talk about in here, other than a relatively small size to be a team, is really what the size of the team could be, right? So I wanted to share that with you today, because this is something I'm just learning about. It never occurred to me before. This, and so where's this? All right, another one. In fact, you'll remember this one because I let you borrow this one a while ago, right? Susan Wheelan. This is a creating effective teams, a guide for members and leaders. And it's a neat read because it says, a lot of it was, well, if this is going on in your group, here's what you can do. And I'm like, yes, that's what I want. I'm going to go do these things that you say I can do and see if I can make an impact. But in her book here, Creating Effective Teams, she refers to a study where she investigated 329 working groups. And this is what was different from just talking about the stages and all that kind of thing about team. She referred to a study, 329 different working groups to determine whether the size of these groups influenced productivity. And guess what? They did. So she found that successful teams contain the smallest number of members necessary to accomplish the goals and tasks. Successful teams contain the smallest number of members necessary to accomplish the goals and tasks. I mean, that's just fascinating to me because I sit on a number of boards and we've got all kinds of board members on that thing. And quite honestly, like in a lot of organizations, I said we've got probably 18 to 20 board members. But really, like any organization, you've got maybe 20% of them that really do any work. The rest come to meetings, they vote, they show up, they hand out flyers, they man the table, they do other things kind of, but they're not like the core group. And so really, if you look at it from a team perspective, that core group is the team. Everybody else is just there. So maybe we've got too many people on the board. But she says, so as an example though, from Susan here, she said that the number is 3 to 6. 3 to 6 members were significantly more productive than the larger groups. And I think there's all kinds of reasons for that, because if you have too many people, well then the people that don't like to speak up won't, and there's no need to, because you're going to have other people that love to speak up and they're going to dominate the conversation. You'll have sidebar conversations. Not everybody can make the meetings. And so there's all of those kinds of things can factor into that. So successful teams, she found, so as we talk about the difference between high performing and successful, is that, that smaller size, or maybe it's not even the smaller size, but the size that's appropriate to accomplish the goals there.
I don't know why, but so for some reason that Heraclitus quote about soldiers in battle just kind of came to mind. Out of every 100 men, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are just targets. 9 are the real fighters, and we're lucky to have them for they make the battle. But 1 is the warrior, and he's the one who brings the others home. But when I think about that, when you said that about the smaller, the more effective, if you were to even just look at how that kind of fleshes out, when I've been part of bigger groups, 10% I can easily say should not have even been there. And then there's another good portion where it's like, they're not necessarily contributing, they're along for the ride. Then when you get to like those core people who are like, let's make a difference, like let's move this forward, they tend to work not only in those group sessions, but also externally to the group sessions to actually make that movement happen.
No, I think that is very appropriate to that. And so I thought about this from like a corporate standpoint. Well, one of my clients, right? So he's got, these 3 different practices out here, and he has, anywhere between 10 people at one location and 40 at the other. Well, he can't have a team of 40, right, in this context to be an effective team, but he has his leadership team, right? So he's a part of that. And he's got 2 or 3 or 4 other of the managers, and that's that management team, and they all lead other aspects out there, but when they come together to make those corporate decisions, that's when that can happen. You don't need all those other people coming in and getting part of that. And that's why the president has a cabinet, right? You have a core group of people, advisors, that's where you work out those kinds of details and come up with the solution that you then disseminate back through them to everybody else. And I guess tie it into that, right? So there's not just the number, but a different aspect of team productivity has to do with some of the systematic or infrastructure, right? Part of the team. So some of your listeners here, they might be leading teams and like, I'm doing all these things. We've got great trust, we got commitment, but man, we still can't quite get over some hump. Back to Larry Osborne here, he pointed out some of these structural and systematic roadblocks that he encountered, that it never occurred to him until he got to a point when once they had a lot of these things figured out, he's like, well, that's why we had so much problem back then. And he had 5, right? So he had 5 roadblocks. I'll just share those here real quick. Systemic and structural roadblocks, all right? He had meeting in the wrong place. I mean, I've tried to do coaching things like in a coffee shop, and sometimes it's easy, but if it's more than 2 or 3 people, it's not easy. So number 1, meeting in the wrong place can be something where you're setting yourself up for failure. Ignoring the relationships between people, pre-existing relationships, budding relationships, whatever they do, that sort of thing. Just, you can't ignore the human side of it. Not meeting enough. I mean, I don't know anybody that says we should meet more often, but if you have effective meetings, really, they work. Number 4, he said that constant turnover, right? And so we talk about that turbulence and the disruption to the equilibrium. And then his last one, and I don't know, maybe he read Susan's book too, but he says having too many members is something else. You have just people, because we've always had this many people. We've always had this representation. Okay, great, but neck it down to that core group to be the team, and then everybody else is part of the group. Learning these has inspired me then to look at the teams I'm a part of, and I mentioned, right, the AUSA thing, and I'm on a couple other teams, and we've got some of these dynamics that happen in here, and I'm talking to the rest of the leaders on these teams. Okay, well, let's shift this up a little bit. Maybe we don't need to meet here. Let's meet there instead, at this time instead of that time. Looking at really trying to set yourself up for success from a infrastructure somewhat perspective might be helpful to somebody.
So with a lot of these pieces, obviously how teams operate within an organization is a reflection of culture, and it also helps to build culture. And in your opinion, how do team dynamics interplay with an organization's culture?
Well, I think teams, because we're talking about teams like, you and me and him and her, and we're going to be a team and do these things. But really, there's those kind of horizontal teams, but there's also vertical teams where, okay, the vice president pulls together all of the program managers, and that is a hierarchical team. Ultimately, so in a bigger business or a bigger organization, nonprofit, whatever it is, the team of teams. So having teams, and then the leaders of those teams are in a leadership team in there. And so as the CEO of whatever it is, you have your core group, and they need to disseminate your message out. And then so all of those subordinate teams of teams all need to be somewhat oriented in that same direction. I think that's how you nest it, right? To use that other phrase, we nest our intent, our objectives, make sure they align with what our higher headquarters or the bigger picture is after as well.
So as teams are in whatever stage they're in, what are some important touch points where teams can become more cohesive?
Well, I'm a people person. It's interesting that in my company, as a defense contractor, we do Zoom meetings all the time. And we do them just like this, where we look at each other and we talk and we nod, and you can see people, I'm multitasking over here on my other screen, reading email and not paying attention, right? So you see all of those, there's cats and dogs and kids and things moving around in the background and all that kind of stuff. One of our subcontractors told us in one of these meetings, he says, in my company, the culture is just the opposite. Nobody turns on their cameras. We have Zoom calls, but we do them as teleconferences. And I thought, well, that's just so sad. Because I'm a people person, right? If I'm an engineer, I'm probably all over that. But, as a people person, I'm like, but there's so much value in being able to see the other person's face, their expressions, and the nonverbal cues, right? So any chance you have to interact, right? So that's a way, right, to infrastructure kind of things, right? So if you're meeting over video, turn the videos on, right? Let's do that. But really, it's those personal engagements, I think. It's because it becomes down to the relationships and building relationships with other people, connecting with other people. Always, to quote John Maxwell, requires commitment. I have to commit to you to connect with you. So, one of my coworkers on one of my teams, her mother just passed away. And I didn't know that. I knew that her mother was ill. And so I had sent her a text, hey, just thinking about you. And you're on my mind and on my heart. So I wanted to reach out. And, well, she sent the next day and she said, thank you for your text message. Yesterday afternoon, it was well timed because my mother had just passed. And so, but it's that connection. And one of my other employees had just moved, right? So I reached out, hey, yeah, so how's everything with the move? And she's like, why are you asking me that? I'm like, well, because we work together and you just moved and I have moved a few times myself and I know it's not very easy and you've got, young children and stuff. And she's like, wow, no, she says, I have never had a supervisor ask me that kind of question before. Well, that's the difference between management and leadership, right? Managers treat everybody the same. Leadership, you treat people like people. When it comes to then those touch points, and not that you have to call everybody, hey, you got any sick kids? Yeah, are they feeling okay? You're not going to do that sort of thing. But when you hear about those, you follow up with them one-on-one. It's not, hey, let me ask you about your sick wife in this meeting so everybody knows that I care about you. No, it's let me ask you about your wife. How's she feeling? Because I care. Yeah, so you have to have that commitment. So I think any opportunity you have to interact with somebody is great. Sometimes you got to manufacture those, right? That's why you had organizational days and you do off-sites and, socials and all that. But really, if you're going to do those, take advantage of them to connect with people because it's so much easier to work with people you know than with people you don't know. General Corelli, one of my most favorite Americans, right? When he was the commanding general of the 1st Cavalry Division during OIF-2, when we came back from that first deployment right there back in 2005, he brought together 2 soldiers. One had been a convoy commander. He brought together that young NCO and put him face to face next to the pilot warrant officer that had been flying security overhead for that convoy for the last 8 months in and out of Baghdad. And these guys talked to each other every day. Because the Apaches were up there and he's on the ground. They were securing and talking and calling in. Every single day it was like the same thing, but they had never met each other. It's human connection. So when he brought them together, I'm getting emotional thinking about it. Yeah, General Corelli. So relationships matter.
It's so easy just with the pace of the world to charge along and be like, oh, I gotta check on Shawn. I gotta check on Natasha. I've got to, do these things. But not really having that connection, right? And nobody would fault anyone for that just because of how fast-paced the world is. But I think that you said it really well that that's what leaders do is they make sure that they have that connection. But also that general, he showed other people how to have that connection too, right? So it wasn't just him and he's having this connection. He knows that everybody does, but he really demonstrated that through his actions for why that was important for others. What leadership advice would you offer current leaders in any organization and any industry?
If trust is the foundation for any kind of high-performing team, I think as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to add value to ourselves. We need to become more valuable so that we can further add value to others. We're in the position, we know we don't. If we don't know, we need to figure out where do we need to improve? What can we strengthen? What do we need to grow on so that I can go out and be a more effective leader for those that I'm charged with leading? Just get better at whatever it is you think you need to be better at. And in science now, the way it used to be, you got to figure out your weaknesses and go fix those. Now it's kind of flipped the other way. It's like, well, outsource your weaknesses to other people and focus on those things you're good at and get better at those, because that's where you're going to really make your money, because that's your natural tendency stuff, right back to the assessments, right? So if you know who you are and you know where your blind spots are, okay, well, mitigate that. I use the example all the time. My wife, she enjoys working in spreadsheets. She enjoys kind of the behind the scenes things and making things work and setting up and scheduling and all that stuff. And she's very, very good at that. Where for me, that drives me nuts. I can do it, but I don't like it, right? I would rather do this. I'd rather go out and talk to the people, but that's my strength. So I try to do whatever I can do to get better at doing that so that I can go engage and have a greater influence in a positive way over the people that I lead. So add value to yourself to make yourself more valuable for others.
I think that there's something for all the reasons that you just said, there's something so valuable at learning how to lead yourself. So throughout the whole session today, you have been doing my favorite thing, which is recommending books.
Yes.
Is there a specific book or resource that you think every leader should read or look at?
Yes. I mean, there are many, right? And there's a lot of good books out there. And the ones that I referred to were just a handful of them. You can't go wrong with Patrick Lencioni. In this particular book, I mean, the full title is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, a Leadership Fable, right? Because the first part of the book is he's talking about essentially a client and what was going on with them. I find that enjoyable to read because it's very relatable. It's not just textbook material. Hey, science says you should do this and don't do that. Instead, he just describes it in scenarios. I'm like, okay, I've lived through this. It's like I worked on this woman's team. And then at the end, he goes into, okay, well, here's how you mitigate those. Here's how you get past that. So I think it's eye-opening because it makes it very easy for you to see yourself in those situations, because more than likely as a leader leading teams, you probably are.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Equipping Leaders podcast. For more leadership development content, you can visit my website, natashacheyenne.com, where you will find my leadership journal with dozens of articles, and the Cultivation Cafe, which is always growing and has leadership frameworks, book recommendations, and inclusion and mental health resources. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha or at Equipping Leaders Podcast, and on Twitter at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.